Thank you very, very much for coming tonight. I think we should get our program moving. It's 7 o'clock. Just a few words. My name is the Reverend Richard Belshaw. I'm an Episcopal priest serving the Seacoast, not this parish, though they're on the Seacoast, so occasionally I might be here. And I'm part of the We the People group that plans lectures and panel discussions and films and events. That's an ecumenical group in Exeter, made up of the Episcopal Church, the Congregational Church, the UU Church, and we are aided and abetted by Phillips Exeter Academy and the Water Street Bookstore. Speaking of the Water Street Bookstore, Dan, a representative from the store, is here with a load of books, of the latest by John Nichols, our speaker, and has asked that the book normally goes for $26.99, and he's selling it tonight for $20, with the hope that you can donate that $6.99, or make it $7, to a charitable organization. And without much further ado, I'm going to introduce the speaker, Marcia Moody, who is a state representative from Newmarket, who will introduce John Nichols. It's great to have you all here. Thank you. And I did forget to say one thing, which is our next event coming up, which is similar to tonight, is a film, Inequality for All, which is the Robert Reich film, and we're showing that at Phillips Exeter on Wednesday, March 26th. So please come for that. Okay, Marcia.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I would be remiss if I didn't also thank our sponsors, We the People and Water Street Bookstore. I have to say that Herb Moyer and Beth and Ginny and Renee have really worked hard to help put on this event, and I really appreciate their sponsoring it. And Dan doesn't need any introduction here in Exeter. And I certainly appreciate his being here and having the books on hand. And I hope that you that live here really support the Water Street Bookstore and know what an asset to the community it is and how helpful Dan has been to launching new authors. And I do want to say one quick word about Herb. Herb is a terrific organizer, and he films so many of these events and preserves them for us, and he's brought so many good events to your town here, and we really appreciate the work that he does. And John, once more, I can't begin to thank you for coming here to New Hampshire and sharing with us your knowledge and your experiences in the media and in politics. You're very much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2 days' time, you're going to be going to the polls and voting in a local election. You're going to be voting for city councilors and selectmen, Nancy Belanger. And you're going to be voting on various warrant articles and other things that you vote on in local elections. Now, John's going to tell you that big money has penetrated the electoral process so deeply that it reaches down even into local elections. And if you're still skeptical, just ask any one of us state reps how we were targeted by the Koch brothers and their citizens, their Americans for Prosperity. And we had Carol Shea Porter at the event in Portsmouth, and she can certainly tell you what big money has done in her campaigns, how it has, fought against her. John's also going to tell you that the Citizens United decision is not something that is brand new. As a matter of fact, it started over 40 years ago with the infamous Lewis Powell memo. And he is also a very good historian, as you will learn from his speech. And he has a very interesting history himself. But he can trace the big money all the way back to the Golden Age and even before. Well, John's personal history, you may have read on the flyer some of his many accomplishments. But what is first and foremost about John that you don't know is that he is a progressive, the real deal. He really is a progressive. And he's also an activist. John is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, and he holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Some of you may remember the Wisconsin uprising in the late winter, early spring of 2011, where huge masses of people got together and they went out into the streets and they occupied the Capitol to protest Governor Scott Walker's taking away the rights of public sector employees. Well, John was right there in the middle of it all, reporting on what was happening. He was on the radio, he was on MSNBC almost every night on the Ed Schultz show, telling you the truth of what was going on. And as a matter of fact, he's written a very good book about it called Uprising: How Wisconsin Renewed the Politics of Protest from Madison to Wall Street. And in it, he'll even tell you that Fox News, in spite of what they said, there are no palm trees that are indigenous to Madison, Wisconsin. But the most interesting thing about John's personal history is the fact that he got his start in journalism younger than anyone in his profession. Get him to tell you how, at a very tender age, that he got his big story in the small town of Union Grove, Wisconsin. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to give you author, journalist, progressive activist, and friend, John Nichols.
Thank you very much. Who would have thought Exeter, New Hampshire on a Sunday night? There must be nothing going on. I'm just like, either that or it's the first night in a very long time when it wasn't so frigidly cold that you felt willing to venture out and reintroduce yourself to the world. I'm very honored that you've come out. And I'm exceptionally honored to be here with my friend Marcia Moody. I want to tell you, I know you have a number of legislators in the room. And New Hampshire, because you have this absurdly giant legislature, which is absolutely what should be. You know, the United States, when it was founded, the theory was that a congressional district should never have more than 30,000 people in it. Today we have some congressional districts which are close to 1 million people. And so this country as a whole has completely broken its link with the idea of direct or connected democracy. New Hampshire is one of the few places that has maintained the notion that you should actually know who represents you, and if they do something bad, you should be able to call them on the phone or go knock on their door and tell them that they are wrong. That's how democracy is supposed to work. And so it's an honor to be in New Hampshire, but I am reminded, I do want to tell you, I am reminded that the diversity of a very large legislature makes all things possible. I was literally approached just moments ago by a state legislator who said to me, well, you know, of course I'm off influenced by Chomsky. And then he's going into Howard Zinn and talking about all this. And I said, you know, most of the rest of the country, that doesn't happen. And Marcia's telling me about somebody else, some legislator last week on the floor of the legislature, I think it may not have been last week, sometime recently, I'm not going to tell the story, it was so horrible, but just you have people in your legislature who will say unbelievably atrocious things on a regular basis, and that's good. No, it's fine. It's fine. Admittedly, they tend to be Republicans, but it's really good to have people who have that flexibility, the freedom, and that the discourse is real, even if it is unpleasant. And I will just tell you, though, that Marcia Moody is an incredibly special legislator, not just in New Hampshire, but nationally. When I was starting to work on the ALEC Exposed project, which is an effort to reveal the workings of the American Legislative Exchange Council, a traditionally very secretive grouping that brought together multinational corporations with legislators in a sort of corporate dating service. It's sort of like ladies' night at the bar. And you know how taverns and bars do the ladies' night? Ladies get in free, but the gentlemen have to pay. Well, in ALEC, the legislators get in for an incredibly small amount of money, $50 or very, very tiny amount of money. The corporations have to pay $10,000 to get there. Well, there's a reason for that, because of course, when you put them together and they start to write legislation, amazingly enough, a lot of the legislation turns out to be really, really good for the corporations. And then the legislators go back and they sponsor it in states across this country. So when we're starting the ALEC Exposed project and really trying to tell the story of how very secretive, behind-the-scenes organizations are manipulating the policy making of states across this country, I went online to see if there was anybody, any legislator who was talking about this, who had written anything about this. And amazingly enough, one article came up, and it was an online, just an essay, I think it turned up in some Portsmouth website, written by New Hampshire State Representative Marcia Moody, detailing the role of ALEC in the New Hampshire legislature. Ahead of the curve, ahead of everybody in the country. She is an amazing. And if you have seen her car, which it's on the parking lot, anyone who's unaware of the fact that she was a supporter of Howard Dean will be reminded of that. But the many bumper stickers on the back of her car. Now, amazingly enough, you would think Dean was still running. Because do you replace the bumper stickers? They look very fresh. But the interesting thing is, I came to this conclusion, having seen Marcia's car, that if someone did rear-end the car, Howard Dean would get a backache. Because he's so plastered across the back of it. But she is a person who wears her politics on her sleeve. And frankly, a lot of folks in New Hampshire do. That's why I've come up to hang out with you a little bit for a couple days, because I need to be reminded of the fact that there is some place in America where democracy is still maybe working at some basic level. Because the truth of the matter is, it isn't working in most of this country. We have degenerated into a situation where the dollar matters more than the vote. Hence the term dollarocracy. It's not a casually chosen term. The challenge in America today is not Democrat versus Republican. It's not liberal versus conservative. It's not Ted Cruz versus Bernie Sanders, although that would be a choice. It is in fact dollarocracy versus democracy, a simple question of whether, at the end of the day, the whole of our politics, and extending from it, the whole of our governance will be defined by dollars or votes. I know that we have tried to convince ourselves that we can have this hybrid, spend 10, 11, 12 billion dollars on an election cycle as occurred in 2012. Literally more money than has ever been spent in any country, in any election cycle, in the history of the world, occurring just 2 years after the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling. My child is 10 years old now, but when she was preschool, she could have figured out that connection. The fact of the matter is, we have blown out the barriers to money in politics. We have flooded money into our politics. And yet, amazingly enough, we sometimes still ask ourselves, why is this so dysfunctional? It is so dysfunctional because it's drowning in money. And that money will force out any decent result politically. I guarantee you this, there's no question, this is not a debatable point. Louis Brandeis was right. 100 years ago, Louis Brandeis said, you can either have immense concentrations of wealth and the influence on politics by those immense concentrations of wealth, or you can have democracy. But you cannot have both. And so that's the great debate that we're in right now. But I don't think people fully take it in without an example. So I hate to do this to you because you're all so well settled in to your places, but I'm going to ask you all to stand up. Everybody in the room, please stand up. I like that woman. She was up instant. She was waiting to be asked to stand up. All right, it's going to go quickly here, so don't worry. Here, I want to see you all. First off, yeah, you look so great. I'm going to take your picture. It won't take but a second. Don't worry. What's that? Yeah, it is. Do you know at my wedding? I swear at my wedding, right? It's out in rural Wisconsin, outside setting, picnic tables and stuff. Guy who'd run for governor of Wisconsin, who had to do some remarks, he stood up and he said, do you know that this gathering of progressives is going to be one of the best opportunities ever for the NSA, because they can just take one shot. But here we go. So if you'll avail or give me this, and I will just take a quick hit here and see if I can get this right. Oh yeah. New Hampshire, it's beautiful people. Look at that, you're fabulous. Okay, so, all right, all the women, please sit down. Yeah, instantaneously, with your big circle around you. All the women, please sit down. All right, anybody in the room who is, let's see, anybody who's a person of color, sit down. Anybody who is not a white Anglo-Saxon male. Okay, yeah, you're going down there. All right, good. Yeah, there you go. That's good. Okay, anybody who is a religious dissenter of any kind, which is to say that you're not a mainstream Protestant. Sit down. Nice, we're taking them down pretty quick here. This is where it gets interesting. Anybody who is not a wealthy landholder, please sit down. I'm assuming the woman in the back is standing because you don't have a chair. All right. Is there anyone really, is there someone very short who I'm not noticing who is standing still? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, at the founding of the American experiment, everyone who is standing in this room, I should take a seat, but everyone who is standing could vote. And everyone who is sitting could not. So it's very important that you understand the journey we've been on as a country. We were founded as a country that denied the franchise to roughly 96% of the people who lived in this country at the point of our initiation. 1787, we did our Constitution. Now, we began to adjust it surprisingly quickly. When we did the First Amendment to the Constitution, and we barred discrimination based on religion, essentially saying there's freedom of religion, that began to free up some space for religious dissenters to participate in our politics. But the fact of the matter is that well into the 19th century, if you met 5 people on the street, 4 of them couldn't vote. Sometimes all 5. It's very, very incredibly tiny number of people allowed to participate. At the founding of the American experiment, when we had an election would be held in a room smaller than this for a congressional seat. And we'd get a group of people together, probably around this number, maybe even a few less. They would all be white guys. And they would all be white guys of a certain economic status, i.e., they held property, and they either were very successful in business or they had a plantation. You owned slaves. And that was your voting class. Now, the interesting thing is that they didn't, they certainly weren't very, pompous about it or elitist. They liked the idea of having elections. They would have two candidates. Intriguingly enough, they were all white guys. And the two candidates would have a wide range of debate for what did one wealthy white guy with a lot of property want versus what did the other wealthy white guy with a lot of property want. Amazingly enough, to give you an example of the range of debate, for the first 60 years of the American experiment, they agreed not to discuss the issue of slavery. No, I'm not kidding. In the Congress of the United States, you couldn't bring up slavery because it was just a gentleman's agreement. We're not going to discuss it. Now, I don't want to kind of suggest that the makeup of the institution might have influenced that choice. But the fact of the matter is, when you have no dispossessed people, when you have no poor people, when you have no women, when you have no people of color, it is very easy to imagine that the issues of concern to the most dispossessed people in your society might be worthy of debate. It's very easy to focus on the issues of white guys. And when they had the election, you might have candidates, and you'd have this crowd in a room. In 1789, 1790, the way that it operated was, if it was in an early fall election, it might be very warm in the room. So they would open the windows up, right? Because they didn't have air conditioning then. Air conditioning didn't come until several years later. And so they would open the windows up. And all of you people, everybody in this room, you would stand outside and look in the window to see who was going to make the decisions about your life. Now, the election was interesting. It maybe had some real sparring, some vitriol, some energetic language. When John Adams ran against Thomas Jefferson, they said horrible things about each other. So it could be theatrical. And you could actually have a favorite in the contest. But you didn't have any role in deciding the contest. You just got to watch it. And what I would suggest is that over the ensuing 225, 230 years, the people who were in that room have worked very, very hard to recreate that experience. They have worked very, very hard to create a circumstance where most of us are spectators as a handful of people make the decisions. Now, it has not been an easy task for them because America wants democracy. America strives for democracy. It's not easy, but de Tocqueville was right. When he toured across this country, he said, this is a place that really wants to be engaged in this thing. This is a place that really wants to expand the process outward. And so over the last 200 years, we've had this incredible arc of democratic expansion. Despite the fact that there were always people that wanted to limit it, we've had this incredible arc of democratic expansion. It wasn't easy. It was never pretty. And I think this is one of the lies that we sometimes tell ourselves. We love to shave the edges off history. We love to make history very, very pleasant. And so, Martin Luther King Jr. was just a happy-go-lucky guy who gave a couple of good speeches and everything was fine. No. Martin Luther King Jr. was a guy who in his last speech of his life said he anticipated that he was going to die young. That he anticipated he would be killed. I mean, that's the brutal reality of this thing, is that this struggle for voting rights, this struggle for democracy has never been a pretty struggle. It's never been an easy struggle. It's never been a generous gifting from the powerful to those without power. We had a civil war because our elites couldn't figure out how to discuss slavery. Now that civil war was horrific beyond imagination. It left hundreds of thousands dead. It ripped apart portions of this country. It ended with the assassination of our president. This was a brutal, horrific experience. And yet, the people who engaged in that war as much as 60, 70 years later, would gather to celebrate its reality. Why? Why did you have a Grand Army of the Republic? Why? Because they believed that they did something that mattered. And the proof of what mattered came in the form of constitutional amendments. How many people here saw the movie Lincoln? Obviously, it was made for you. But what was the dynamic reality of the movie Lincoln? What were they arguing about? A constitutional amendment. Why? Because Lincoln was not a fool. He understood that despite the fact that hundreds of thousands had died, despite the fact that the country had been torn apart, that to lock in the accomplishment of that war, the Emancipation Proclamation, you needed to constitutionally guarantee that African American men, in this circumstance, would have access to the franchise, that they would have equal protection under the law. And amazingly enough, for a brief period, African Americans had the vote in this country. African American men were allowed to vote. And the amazing thing is, we have no firsts in Congress as regards African Americans, right? Or very few firsts. Shirley Chisholm gets points. But by and large, because the accomplishment was made in the 1860s and 1870s. African Americans started getting elected to Congress in the 1870s. Now, this was very unsettling. Remember I told you there's always this kind of push and pull, and we had the reemergence of segregation, Jim Crow, the diminishing of that franchise right. So even when you do a constitutional amendment, you do not always guarantee the progress. But an interesting thing happened when those constitutional amendments in the aftermath of the Civil War were enacted. Another group of people noticed that you could amend the Constitution and get access to the franchise. Women. And women are like sitting around saying, what? You mean all we got to do is amend the Constitution and we get to vote? And it is notable that the women's suffrage movement took off as a political reality in almost exactly the same period as when you started to see these amendments to expand the franchise to African Americans. Because people were suddenly realizing, hold it, you're telling me the Constitution was not written in stone, handed down from the beyond to Michelle Bachmann to exist forever as penned by elite personnel? No, that we can change it, that we can improve it? And why, yes, we can. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said the cruelest thing that one generation could do to the next would be to tell them to live under the Constitution that first generation had written, because that would ensure that throughout history, the pathologies of one time would apply to all future times. So Jefferson said, you have to water the tree of liberty with the blood of patriots every 20 years. He was not trying to give you some zombie movie scenario. Jefferson was saying that every 20 years we need to renew the Republic. You have to review the Constitution. You have to update it to make it relevant to our times. Thomas Paine said the Constitution should never be viewed as a set in stone or static document. It must be a moving document. It must constantly evolve with our times, with our people, as we begin to see folks as human beings who we had previously seen as 3/5 of a human being, if you're an African American, or if you're a woman, not measurable at all. And so the reality is that Civil War moment unleashed an imagination in this country about what democracy might be. It took a long time. It took another 60, 70 years to get the franchise for women. And, I was at a college campus, and, college students are the brightest bunch. And, sharp as can be. And so I was talking about some of these issues and talking about some of the changes that I think need to happen. And a young man said, well, yeah, you're talking about getting money out of politics. That's really hard. It's not easy like getting the votes for women. And it's a very innocent young man who really it was actually a positive statement. You should in no way see it as a negative. This guy thought, well, of course women can get the vote. Why would, who could possibly oppose that? And yet, the history will tell us that women starved themselves, literally to the point of death, to fight for that amendment. They chained themselves to the White House. They were arrested. They were jailed. They were force-fed in brutal circumstances. The battle for women's suffrage, while certainly not comparable to the battle for African American suffrage in the Civil War, the battle for women's suffrage was never a pretty or easy circumstance. It wasn't just about putting a Girl Scout sash on and marching in a parade. There were people who suffered horribly to achieve that goal. And yet in 1920, they got it. We expanded the franchise to bring women into the process. And I know you're sitting there saying, well, that's all great. That's all fine. But what did it really matter? Well, let me just tell you one thing. You know, whenever you hear that comment about the gender gap in politics, if women hadn't gotten the vote in 1920, Mitt Romney would be the president of the United States today. It matters when we expand the franchise. It changed. Paul Ryan would be setting your economic policy. And so expanding the franchise matters dramatically. And the 20th century in this country was a period of radical, wild, exciting expansion of the franchise. Women got the vote, and then an interesting thing happened. People thought, hey, here's a novel notion. If we're going to give women the right to vote, maybe we should give the first Americans, Native Americans, the people who were here before everybody else came, the right to vote too. Did you know that the right to vote, Native Americans in most states didn't get the right to vote until well into the 20th century. And then people were like, you know, maybe even Latinos, because remember that Latinos in the Southwest, many of them were here before the founding of the American experiment. And they started to get the vote, and you're like, wow, this is an amazing process we're moving through in here. By the 1950s, 1960s, they were actually talking about respecting the Constitution and making real the promise of voting rights for African Americans. And a very fascinating thing happened. How many of you can remember 1963? Good, I'm glad a few of you can, but that's okay. At the last event we were at, some guy said, yeah, that's the year I got married. And I think he had his wife with him there, so that was a very positive that it lasted. But in 1963, 1964, that's when we eliminated the poll tax. Remember when I said anybody who's not a wealthy landholder, sit down? Well, we had eased it along the way, but until the mid-1960s, this country allowed a wealth barrier to voting. Till the mid-1960s, there was a constitutional amendment enacted in 1964 that said you cannot charge people money to vote. And then amazingly enough, that 60s decade ended with an even more incredible concept, which is that if you are going to draft a young man to go and die in a war, you might want to give him an opportunity to vote on whether that war should take place. And we lowered the voting age to 18. This is an incredible arc of expansion of voting rights. Now, we didn't go all the way. There are still prisoners who are not allowed to vote in this country. There are still ex-felons who are not allowed to vote in this country. We have some barriers to voting in this country that most of the rest of the world would find absolutely absurd. In Germany, prison wardens, as part of their job, are required to have maximized turnout of their prisoners in elections. In America, we don't allow you even after you're out of prison. So we still have real barriers. We have voter suppression. We have voter ID laws. We have all kinds of barriers to voting that come into place. But the simple reality is that where we've come from 1787 to where we are today is one of the most epic stories of expansion of the franchise history of the world. It is an amazing and really beautiful, beautiful story. But the problem is, right around the time that we gave those 18 to 21-year-olds the vote, something weird started happening in America. Something very, very strange. And I'm not talking about Marcia's efforts to legalize marijuana or something like that. I'm telling you that as we expanded the franchise sufficiently, democracy started to work. I know it's a weird concept, that it could actually work. But we started, look at what happened in the 1960s. Right? Women started to say, you know what, maybe we should get equal pay. And women started to say, well, maybe we should have control over our bodies. And people of color started to say, you know, 400 years of slavery and segregation, maybe we should have fair treatment in the workplace. And you had all sorts of expansion of education programs. We created Title IX to say that young women should have same access to programs as young men. I mean, we were really radically changing as a country, fundamentally changing. And some of the biggest changes were in the area of economics. Gaylord Nelson, the great senator from Wisconsin, held a 9-year open hearing on the safety of food and drugs. We imagined that food and drugs were always safe. They weren't. No. This was a period in which the food and drug companies, which had so much power, suddenly were facing regular challenges. What happened in 1970? Earth Day. Communities across this country gathered. Millions of people came out to say that our policies should protect the environment, not just protect the ability to make money. What did we get under Richard Nixon? Admittedly a socialist, but hardly the most radical socialist of our time. But under Richard Nixon, what did we get? the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the largest expansion of public housing, major programs to deal with inflation. Where did you get your indexed Social Security? Richard Nixon. I mean, this was, even conservative Republicans were starting to say, boy, we can't stop this democracy thing. It's on the march. It's just we're gonna have to let the people have their will. There's an interesting thing happening down in Virginia. There was a lawyer. And I don't know how many people in the room are lawyers. I grew up in a lawyer family, so I gotta have a certain respect. I went to law school at Marquette in Wisconsin, so I have a certain regard for lawyers. But there's the occasional lawyer that's maybe thinking a little too hard. And there was a lawyer down in Virginia, and he had worked with a lot of lawyers in the tobacco industry, tobacco companies. Late 1960s, early 1970s, a very interesting thing happened. There was a New Year's Eve. And on New Year's Eve, at about 11:35 at night, they ran the last ever cigarette commercial on television. Because we had actually succeeded in getting ads for a cancer-making device off TV. And this lawyer down in Virginia said, do you know what? If they can make us take tobacco ads off TV, they can, where does it end? Where does it end? Next thing you're going to know, they're going to be saying cars should be safe. Or, or that our drugs should be safe. Or, who knows what they're going to tell us to do next. And so this lawyer wrote a memorandum. And he circulated it only to the CEOs of major corporations, only to the key players in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The lawyer was a guy named Lewis Powell. And the Lewis Powell memo, his memo that he produced, said, this democracy thing is really rolling. Do you know who the most respected person in the nation is? Ralph Nader. Do you know what's happening in elections? Young people are starting to vote. They're electing students to city councils. What's happening all over the South? We're getting multiracial congressional delegations. And Powell was not some big racist. He had actually been one of the more moderate players in the South. But he was just saying, we're getting a lot of people we cannot recognize coming into our Congress, and they are making demands on our politics that we just haven't seen before. We, the business and corporate class of this country, had better figure out a way to deal with this, or this democracy thing is going to really change who's in charge of this country. Something very dangerous is going to happen. Elections are going to start to matter. Who wins an election is going to have meaning, rather than to just be an exercise, rather than to just be a theater. And so Lewis Powell said in his memorandum, we got to get organized, guys. And it was guys. He said, we got to move our lobbying shops from places like Boston and New York and Chicago. We got to move them all to Washington so we can be where the action is. Do you know that most corporations did not have lobbyists in Washington in 1970? They weren't there. Do you know that in 1970, it's very interesting, in 1970 in Washington, D.C., there were more journalists covering politics than PR people trying to influence journalists. I mean, it was a different world. But he also said something else. He said, we're going to have to figure out how to get more money into politics. We got to start giving lots of money to campaigns. We got to start organizing ways to influence the politics of this country, because that's the only way we're going to counter all this democracy stuff that's going on. And then he said, you know what else? So we're going to have to figure out how to sell our ideas. So we're going to have to create think tanks. We're going to have to create operations to come up with ideas. And we're going to have to create organizations to try and, advance our ideas. We're going to actually have to consider creating our own media. And it's a crazy idea. I know even now it's unimaginable. But he actually suggests the idea that there might be conservative pro-business television networks. That you might have like a talk radio star, prominent talk radio people that would talk all the time about how good conservative ideas and corporate things are. Wrote out all this stuff in his memo, proposed all these things. And a friend of mine, Jeff Clement, great lawyer down in Massachusetts, he actually went to the Powell papers and he looked through the papers, because this memo was a secret at the time, it was not publicly known. He looked through, and there were all these like notes from CEOs saying, can you get me a copy of that memo? It was like moving around like pornography. It was like, wow, I gotta see that thing. And it swept through the corporate community, and they responded. They moved their lobbying shops. They started hiring massive PR operations. They created, in 1973, what got created? The Heritage Foundation, huge think tank. 1973, what else got created? The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. What else coming out of that time? The American Conservative Operations. We hear about the CPAC conference, roots going back, the groupings that are involved in that going back to that period. The generation of right-wing talk radio, a lot of right-wing media coming along in that period. We had, if you look back, you can actually trace, we do it in the book, we trace the dates year after year where these things came into being. And the most interesting thing of all, that flow of money into politics, that started to creatively think, that historically a lot of businesses thought, well, it would be absurd for us to spend money on politics. We're in business, that's what we do. They didn't imagine the idea that if you bought the regulatory process, it was another way to make money. If you bought the tax process, it was another way to make money. That rethinking of how you engage is rooted in this period. But it could never have fully come to fruition if one last thing hadn't happened. Richard Nixon, remember the radical environmentalist? Richard Nixon had asked Lewis Powell a number of times to accept an appointment to the Supreme Court. Now, Lewis Powell was a corporate lawyer, and he said, the Supreme Court's for suckers, right? You can't make big money on the Supreme Court. So he turned Richard Nixon down. I don't know if he said those exact words, but he turned Richard Nixon down, by all accounts, several times. And then, shortly after he wrote the memo, Nixon asked again, and Powell said, yeah, what the heck? I'm getting older. I think I could retire to the Supreme Court. And so Nixon made the appointment. Powell was a moderate Southerner, no associations with the Ku Klux Klan that they knew of. And so he passed very, very quickly through the approval process, the confirmation process. When Powell came before the Senate, only one senator voted against him. The whole Senate, one guy voted against him. Fred Harris, the dirt on his boots populist from Oklahoma. And Fred Harris said in the New York Times article, he said, when I looked at that guy, I just didn't think he was going to be all that good for the working man. And the interesting thing is that Fred Harris, who I know, he's still alive, he teaches down in New Mexico. I've often said to Fred Harris, you nailed it, brother. Because Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court was not some big right-wing fanatic. In fact, on the Supreme Court, the interesting thing is, Lewis Powell often took a moderate stance on many social issues. And because we don't have a media in this country that covers economics, they simply said, well, Powell's a moderate. And they never even, they don't even look at the fact that most Supreme Court cases today actually deal in economic issues, not abortion rights or gay rights or a lot of the issues that get covered so much. And so Powell kind of sailed through his court tenure. The only thing that gets interesting is if you look back at every time a major issue arose as regards money in politics, Lewis Powell said, guys, I know how hard it is to write those decisions. I'll take care of it. And so again and again you find Lewis Powell as a major contributor to decisions saying, we really got get rid of the barriers to money in politics. We gotta free this system up. Why? Money is speech. We gotta let people speak. Well, not people, corporations, but corporations are people, my friend. And so, in the Buckley v. Vallejo case, there's Powell, his hands there. In the Bellotti case, an incredible, much lost to history case from the late 70s, early 80s period in Massachusetts, big fight. Again, Powell in the forefront saying, yes, corporations can spend money in politics. Powell again and again laying the groundwork for freeing up money to come into politics in an overwhelming way. And then here's the interesting thing. He probably would have gotten his way as a justice, except he was opposed by a militant, by a radical, by the one Supreme Court justice who just said no to unrelenting free spending money in politics. A guy who said in dissents and sometimes in affirmative decisions, if you knock down the barriers to corporate money in politics, if you knock down the barriers to the wealthy spending whatever they want to influence our politics, our elections will become shams. And we will lose the promise of democracy to a process where it is a spectator sport where the working people, the great mass of people look in and the decisions are made by a handful of wealthy people. One great American radical stood up to Lewis Powell. William Rehnquist. No, Rehnquist objected again and again and again. And this is an important thing for people to understand. This is not about Democrat and Republican. This is not about left and right, liberal, conservative. This is about dollarocracy versus democracy. And a sincere conservative can recognize it just as easily as a sincere progressive. There's nothing complex about this stuff. Rehnquist served as a barrier to this vision of opening up our politics to money. Rehnquist, who, when he left the court, when he passed on, was viewed as one of the most conservative people ever to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. And yet, he wasn't a corporatist. He wasn't there as a representative of corporate interests. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court's Chief Justice today, John Roberts, is of the Lewis Powell school. When the Citizens United case came before our Supreme Court, imagine this if you're in court and you're suing your neighbor and you're saying, my neighbor dumped some trash on my yard and I would like the $25 it cost me to clean that up. And the judge, what if the judge said to you, you know what, you're really ripping yourself off. You're not asking for enough. Come back and write me a brief and ask for your neighbor's house. That's what John Roberts did in the Citizens United case. Citizens United was just a silly little group that made a nasty documentary about Hillary Clinton. And they wanted to run some TV ads associated with the documentary. They got in trouble for that, and so they sued the Federal Election Commission. But Powell said, you're not asking for enough. You just want to run your silly little TV ads and pick on Hillary Clinton. Why don't you ask me if we can just let corporations spend whatever they want to influence our political process? And the Citizens United people are like, wow, really? We can do that? Okay. And so the lawyers all came back in. Powell had asked for additional briefs. They came back in and they asked for a lot. And, I'm sorry, not Powell. Roberts had asked for additional briefs. They asked for a lot, and they gave it to him to influence the political processes of the United States. That the basic barriers that we had established for more than 100 years were knocked down, and the money could flow in. And in a series of decisions since then, and one of which could even come out tomorrow, the McCutcheon decision, this court has knocked down barrier after barrier after barrier to money in politics. It's a long story with several arcs, but it brings us back to when you were all standing up. Each time you sat down, we pushed you out of the democratic process. Finally, we had, the 6 or 7 white guys, but even they didn't have enough money to stay in the process. And so we got you all sitting down. When you're sitting down, you're a spectator, right? You're here you come to the theater, you come to see the event. The power of money in politics is to sit you back down. You still have the vote. You've got the right to vote. There's no question of that. But when we begin to flow $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, $5 billion, $6 billion, $7 billion, $8 billion, $9 billion, $10 billion, $11 billion into an election season. That's what happened in 2012. When you flow that much money in, and when you pour it into television, you create a circumstance where your politics is defined not by all of you folks deciding what you want. It's defined by the folks who can pay for all that television. And let me tell you in closing here what that television does, because it's a big deal. It's a very big deal. Television ads are not put on to get you to vote. They are not put on TV to get you to switch your vote from one candidate to another. They are put on television to get you to not vote. Television, political television advertising is the most ambitious voter suppression initiative of our time. It is far more extensive, far more egregious, far more extreme than a voter ID bill, than a elimination of same-day voting registration, all these other things. Because what does a television ad, by and large, tell you to do? In some Senate races in 2012, and it'll certainly be true in New Hampshire this year, in some Senate races in 2012, over 95% of the ads were negative. So what a TV ad tells you to do is to hate someone, to despise someone. The ad doesn't come on and say, you know, my opponent is an honorable man. We have some honest differences. He believes in this, I believe in this. I think my views are better. They actually used to be ads like that. If you go back, I've watched them all. You go back in the 1980s or 1950s, Eisenhower would come on TV and say stuff like that. Even into the 70s and 80s, if you looked at the ads, they were like so gentle. So, you know, they're just like, they'd have these like biographical ads and, you know, like the Carters throwing around a football or something, like Jimmy Carter picking up peanuts and things like that. So that's not what television advertising is anymore. Television advertising is a behemoth creature has climbed from the swamp, and that creature is on the ballot as my opponent. If you vote for them, the gates of hell will open and all evil will flood the earth forevermore. Right? They don't make zombie movies as bad as television commercials. And what happens? What is the impact of those television commercials? In America, in 2012, we had a hell of an election. Barack Hussein Obama was running against Willard Mitt Romney, right? I mean, these were different men by any measure. And Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, Joe Biden versus Paul Ryan, I mean, that's different. I'm sorry. And then these congressional races across the country, Senate races, you know, Aiken in Missouri, you know, like legitimate rape. I mean, you had real fundamental issues in play. We were debating whether to privatize Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We were debating whether women's advances of the 20th century might be reversed. We were debating immigration and economics and fundamental issues. Fundamental issues. And we couldn't get a turnout much over 50%. Almost half of us didn't vote. You meet two people on the street, the likelihood is that one of them didn't vote. And the incredible thing about that is it was a relatively high turnout election for America. In 2010, the definitional election of our time, the election in which Barack Obama lost his governing majority in the U.S. House and also had a significant setback in the Senate. When conservative Republican governors swept to power in states across this country, Scott Walker, John Kasich, all of these people, Paul LePage in Maine. 2010, very, very incredible election. Turnout under 40%. Actually only around 37, 38%. Do you understand what I'm saying? You meet three people on the street after 2010, definitional election of our time, two of them didn't vote. This circumstance they've created has worked brilliantly. We are driving great masses of people outside of the room. They may see the ads on TV, They may watch the process looking in through the window, but they're no longer in the game. And we say, well, shame on them. They're not good citizens. Excuse me. If I tell you again and again and again that both candidates in a race are the spawn of Satan, there's a reasonable chance that you might choose not to vote for either of them. And I know you're going to say, well, they should read a newspaper, or they should set out to inform themselves. But over the last 5 years, well, last 10 years in this country, we've lost more than 30,000 newspaper employees as newspapers across this country have shut down and shed massive portions of their staff. Last 20 years, we've lost almost 20,000 on-air radio personalities in this country as the Telecommunications Act of 1996, as well as a series of other changes in broadcast media regulation, allowed for national syndication of shows so that local media began to decline across the board. And in recent years, television stations have begun to shave minutes off their evening newscasts to fit in more political commercials. The fact of the matter is, yeah, in Las Vegas, they did a fascinating thing in Las Vegas. They expanded their newscast to an hour and everybody thought, that's great, we're going to get more news. No, they expanded their newscast to an hour to fit in more ads. And so you have these like little blips of, yeah, it's going to be, it's Las Vegas, it's going to be hot tomorrow. And then they'd come back with another ad, and then they'd say, and then they'd come back and say, but, in New Hampshire it's cold. And then they come back with another ad. And so the fact of the matter is, you can blame your fellow citizens. You can say they're just not good enough citizens. Or you can recognize the reality that we have created a structure in this country, a political structure in this country, that discourages democratic participation. It actually makes a lot of Americans, especially the youngest, the poorest, the most vulnerable among us, check out of the process. And that creates a political reality that is definitional. There is a reason why, if we're talking about going to war on the other side of the world, there's all the money you can ever ask for. But if you're talking about school lunch programs, we just don't have enough money. There is a reason why we're talking about taking a Keystone pipeline right through the middle of the aquifer of the country, the water that literally underpins our entire agricultural system at the most vital levels, and it's actually being taken seriously. There is a reason why we have not addressed global warming. There is a reason why issue after issue after issue ends up with a result that is incredibly good for the status quo and incredibly bad for the great mass of Americans. There is a reason why income inequality is expanding at one of the most rapid rates in the history of this country, even of the world, right as we speak. There is a reason where even with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, we didn't protect labor rights, we didn't expand the minimum wage in any kind of meaningful way, why we continue to have a crisis as regards governance. We have created a system in this country where the dollar matters more than the vote. We have laid the groundwork for a dollarocracy. And this puts us at the critical turning point as Americans. It is, I say this without any hesitation, without any qualms. The next 5 to 10 years will define this country, one way or the other. We cannot accept this anymore, or this will be our reality. We might elect Democrats, we might elect Republicans. We might elect conservatives, we might elect liberals. But at the end of the day, we will operate within an incredibly narrow range of possibilities, and that range of possibilities will give us always the option of war, always the option of massive Pentagon budgets, always the option of taking from the poor and giving to the rich. But the reverse options will rarely, if ever, be on the table. That's one side. The other side is if we choose to say no. If we choose to say that just as our ancestors did, we will amend our Constitution in the name of democracy. We will amend the Constitution of the United States to say money is not speech, corporations are not people, And citizens have a right to organize elections in which the vote matters more than the dollar. Unless we amend our Constitution to say the right to vote cannot be constantly in play. It cannot go before the Supreme Court or before Congress to decide who has the right to vote. No, we have to have a guaranteed right to vote and a right to have that vote counted for all Americans. And unless, and we're in this process of amending the Constitution, what the heck? Unless we say that the person who gets the most votes for president should be the president of the United States, and we shouldn't have an electoral college that can be gamed so that George Bush can become president and send us into a war in Iraq, unless we say we've got to get rid of the electoral college. We're going to continue to live in a circumstance as defined by the dollar, not the vote. And you say, oh, I know, you're sitting there saying, wow, Mr. Nichols, if it was just up to us, we'd amend the Constitution. What the heck? A lot of us would do that. We're pretty good for that. But you see, I'm afraid that when I get in the car and I'm driving down these dark New Hampshire roads tonight, some doubts might creep into my head about whether it's possible to amend the Constitution. Because as we noted, the Constitution handed down in stone to Michelle Bachmann, it cannot be amended. It's never been amended. Why? You can't change anything in this country. It's locked in stone. It's never been amended except maybe 27 times. And the founders would have not wanted us to amend it, except that, of course, they amended it 10 times in the first 4 years. And then they amended it again about 15 years later after the vice president shot the Secretary of the Treasury. And they decided they needed a new way to pick vice presidents. We have always amended the Constitution when it was time to do so. And you say, yeah, but that was in the past. Those were superhumans. They were better than us. We are inferior creatures. The American populace has degenerated in its quality and its content. We're the debris of the American story. We can't possibly do what our ancestors did. We must accept the circumstance handed to us. Well, let me just close with a story. In 1910, 100 years ago, if a little girl ran down the front steps of her house, it was unlikely that she was going to school. She was probably going to work. 6, 7, 8-year-old girl. And in this part of the country, many parts of the country, she'd be going to work in a mill. And she might well have been a bobbin girl. My daughter, my 10-year-old daughter, has a book about bobbin girls. It's very cute. Doesn't have the whole story, though, because, see, the reason bobbin girls worked in the mill was because their fingers were very, very small. They could reach into the machinery and change a bobbin, whereas a woman's big, fat finger just couldn't do it, right? And a man's big, fat, big, heavy finger, that couldn't do it. But a little girl's tiny finger, that could get in there and change the bobbin. There's only one problem. Sometimes, and this is not often in the storybooks, sometimes the machine would start working, and the little girl would lose a finger or a hand. And then she'd be sent home. Right? They politely bandage her up and send her on home. And the owner of the company was not held to account because it was a gilded age. And in that gilded age, when you owned the workplace, you got to define what happened within it. You didn't have to put up with government regulations or child labor laws or all the structural barriers to job makers making jobs. You got to do what you wanted to do. But if that little girl came of age, maybe she got a job in a textile factory, maybe in a clothing factory. And in the big cities, those factories were often on the 10th or 11th floor of a building. And oh, they were amazing places. A whole room full of young women, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, sewing clothes and shirts. Girls from Italy and Germany and Ireland, all kinds of languages. Jews, Muslims, Christians, African Americans coming up from the South, Latinos coming up, all these people working, women of all these different backgrounds, working, sewing, and when the room caught on fire, when a fire started to sweep through all that clothing material, these young women were strong and they wanted to live. They certainly could, and so they ran to the doors to run those 10, 11 floors to safety, but they found the doors nailed shut because the owners of those textile plants and factories did not want women to steal a bathroom break during their 10, 11, or 12-hour day. And so the women at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory had to decide whether they would burn alive or jump 11 stories to their death. And when the mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and grandparents came to collect the bodies of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire victims, the hundreds of bodies spread over the streets of New York City, they didn't just collect their beloved sisters and daughters and take them to the funeral. They said that those funerals would be public events. Tens of thousands of people filled the streets of New York City. And there was a constant refrain. These women did not have the ability to define their own fate. They could not vote. They could not participate in elections. And if they could vote and they could participate in elections, they couldn't choose their United States Senate because senators were appointed, not elected. So the Congress of the United States was not in the democratic power of the people. And even if they had the ability to choose a Congress, they could not write tax laws. They could not use the structure and power of government to hold corporations to account because structurally our government lacked the ability to even ask a basic contribution from the wealthy and from corporations. That was roughly 100 years ago. 7 years later, actually 9 years after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, women had the right to vote. The United States Senate was elected. And we had created an income tax system that allowed for progressive taxation, and via that opened the door to a regulatory state that could tell corporations and the wealthy that they had a duty to society. Nothing that happened in the New Deal could have happened in any kind of realistic way without the changes that occurred between 1910 and 1920. And all of those changes occurred as a result of constitutional amendments. Your grandmothers, your grandfathers, your ancestors amended the Constitution 3 times in 7 years to make real the promise of American democracy. I come to this great first-in-the-nation state tonight to tell you, you must be as good as your ancestors. I don't want you to change your first priority issues. If you're against war, fight against war. If you're for education programs, fight for education. If you're for nutrition programs, fight for nutrition. If you're concerned about the environment, fight for the environment. But you must make a part of your agenda the structural change of our political processes in this country. You must commit to constitutional amendments, and you must demand that your elected representatives fight that brief in your legislature and your Congress. Marcia Moody's on board. Carol Shea Porter is a sponsor of every proposed constitutional amendment to get money out of politics. It's happening in America. 16 American states have demanded formally through legislative action or referendums that Congress act to overturn the Citizens United ruling and to get big money out of our politics. The moment is happening, brothers and sisters, but we have to turn all of our energy to it because the time is short. And it is in this time, not some future moment, it is in this time that we will decide whether America is to be a dollarocracy or a democracy. I want to err on the side of democracy. Thank you very much. This is a significant part of the book. In fact, we have 3 chapters on media in the book. And the best way to understand the moment that we are in is to recognize that my friend and someone many of you may have read, Tom Frank, the author of What's the Matter of Kansas? he explores this question of why people vote against their own best interest. And in fact, Tom goes back to Kansas and spends a lot of time there, and he finds that it's at the heart of what you're saying. Because there is one thing that will make someone vote against their own economic interest. Actually, probably two things. Number one, your kids, right? And anybody who's a parent knows that you voted against your own economic interest constantly. And my child told me that while she was very delighted I would be speaking to the folks in Exeter, New Hampshire, she hopes that I can find her some calico critters while traveling. And so, your kids, but it's also your religious faith. If indeed you are a person of faith, it's very, very powerful in people's lives. And the fact of the matter is, when you have a winner-take-all politics, right? When the only thing that matters is winning, political players will even game faith if they think it can have influence on our politics. Now, to some extent, both sides have done it. I want to emphasize, this is not simply something that conservatives do. It can play both ways. But it's a difference between when the politicians do it, and every politician ends a speech with "God bless America." And, you know, it's Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives. It's actually, we see a lot of that. But it's different when the media becomes so highly engaged in this process. Because one of the reasons we established a freedom of the press in this country was to have a check and a balance, not just on government, but on the excessive behaviors of politicians. I mean, what is the point of a free press if it is not to inform us before an election of what we ought to know about the people who are in play? And their hypocrisies, their high crimes, their misdemeanors. You know, much as I love, you know, accountability, I like to avoid the accountability moment by knowing before I elect somebody that they're going to be a bad player. And the big crisis in America today is best understood via a Woody Allen metaphor. In the movie Annie Hall, which I suspect a few of you have seen. In Annie Hall, Woody Allen is telling a story of two elderly women at an automat in New York City. And the one woman says to her friend, "The food here is horrible. It's the worst food I have ever tasted." The other woman said, "Yes, and such small portions." That's the reality of our media today. Our crisis in media is not Fox. I mean, it's easy to blame Fox or Rush Limbaugh. That's, you know, it's fun talking points. But the reality is that the crisis in media today is that we have squeezed so much journalism out and put so much commentary in that we end up in a circumstance where there's a lot of debate and a lot of comment on very little information. And the real crisis of this thing is that we end up having these rip-roaring, passionate debates, right? Where literally you will hear people say unimaginable things about political figures. I mean, I cannot begin to emphasize what a fascinating experience. I drive around the country a lot, I'm traveling a lot. To hear what people say about the President of the United States is really astounding. And it is crude at a level that I literally cringe. And this is true when Bush was president as well. I cringe when my daughter is in the car and I have the radio on. Because there is simply no regard. It is a brutal, constant takedown. It is a theater of the absurd. And this is the thing, I've come around to your core point. What has happened to our media today is, as we have laid off tens of thousands of journalists, as we have gotten rid of so much of our local news coverage, as we have squeezed journalism, literally, to a point, and then filled the void with blogs, some of which are wonderful, but a lot of which are just, you know, opinion, with cable shows that are overwhelmingly opinion rather than information. As we fill that, how do we make it interesting? We make it interesting by screaming, by yelling, by turning up the volume and saying, this is not a matter of practical political difference. This is a matter of faith itself. The good Lord is concerned not just about who wins the football game, but also about who wins the election. And that's winner-take-all politics. And I really want to emphasize to you that while I personally see some of those egregious examples on the right, it is not just a right-left problem. This is a reality of having so little journalism that most of our discourse is defined by that money that flows in, by the advertising, by the public relations, by the lobbying. And don't think that lobbying just occurs in Congress. It also occurs for public opinion. Now, understand this in the book. We close off with looking at the rest of the world. How we do elections is absolutely absurd to the rest of the world. Comically absurd to the rest of the world. In Norway, they bar political ads before elections. Do you know why? Simple. They said, why before an election would you let politicians go on and just spew venom about each other? That's the one time in which voters should be informed. So we should turn our TV time off instead of putting all this entertainment on. We should have lots of debates and more journalism and more information about what's going on so people can make an informed decision. So they clear the ads out. Most countries around the world, Britain doesn't have, constant 30-second spots. They have things that are called party political broadcasts that are produced under a set of rules that are extensive, that go through all the issues. The parties can put them together, but at the end of the day, it has to have content. It has to be real. And so we have ended up in a situation where we've created a scream fest. Vile, cruel, mean-spirited, dispiriting to democracy. And we get 3 in 10, maybe 4 in 10 voters voting in key congressional elections. That'll happen this year. In Germany, 72, 75%. In Norway, 80, 85%. In Belgium, they're pushing toward 95% turnout. Countries around the world, countries with which we would want to compare ourselves, have massive turnouts of voters. We don't. And the interesting thing is, you know what they also all have in common? Single-payer Medicare for all health care, right? Education systems that are affordable. You don't end up in massive debt when you finish your college. Employment systems that actually can adjust to economic downturns, as they did in Germany. So they actually cut back some hours, filled the void, so that they didn't have massive unemployment. Germany now holding up the whole of the European community with its relatively strong economy. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
When you push everybody out of the process, when you make it a scream fest, when you make it offensive to those who just can't stand to listen to another, and then invite in those who are so freaked out they will vote out of fear rather than out of any thinking, you end up with a mess. That's what we got to deal with, my friend. Okay.
I'd like to be a little bit more specific about the contents of the amendments that you're recommending. Yes. And anticipating that you're going to say that corporations are not people, I'm also, because that's what I usually hear, I'm also concerned about high-income individuals, not corporations, and limiting their ability, because we have tremendously wealthy individuals nowadays.
It's a superb question, thank you. And I always plant someone in the audience to ask me for specifics. And I usually make it a knitter. So thank you. Look, on the specific of amendments, there are many, many amendments that have been proposed. It's important to understand that more than 100 members of Congress have endorsed amendments to overturn Citizens United now. This is not some fringe activity. This is something that has moved very much into the mainstream. The amendments vary in form and character and content. They are also sponsored not just by Democrats, but also now a key Republican co-sponsors come forward. Walter Jones, a very conservative congressman from down in the Carolinas. So it's important to recognize that this is not simply a project of Democrats or even a project of the left. It is becoming a much more mainstream recognition of a need to change. Your point is very, very well taken, because while we talk about corporations and corporate money in politics, the reality is that many of the massive inflows into politics come from wealthy individuals. They come from individuals who have usually made immense amounts of money through a corporate power, but have then banked it themselves and then move it into the process. Actually, there's incredible fluidity to do this. It's very, very easy for a wealthy individual to basically give as much as they want via a so-called independent expenditure. We now have in this country an amazing thing that political consultants don't work for campaigns anymore. There's still some that do, but an increasing number of the smartest political consultants have become boutique consultants, where they literally sit down with a very wealthy person and tailor a campaign based on what that wealthy person wants to do. And again, not just on the right. While Sheldon Adelson is very, very engaged in doing this, so are some environmentalists on the left who are pouring money in to campaigns because they want to influence there. So it's become a very easy place for wealthy people to come into this process. Here is the basic concept, to my mind, of what we ought to do. What we ought to say is that citizens, through their elected representatives, be it their city council, their state legislature, their Congress, have a right to regulate elections. They have a right to structurally determine how much money is spent in campaigns and how it is spent. And this is a radical concept, an almost unheard of concept, which existed in America through most of the 20th century. That's essentially what I'm talking about, is going back to a situation where we allow Congress and our legislatures to set spending limits and contribution limits. That's what we've lost. We lost contribution limits and a lot of the other structural limits with the Buckley v. Vallejo decision back in the 70s. We lost some of the basic limits on corporations with Bellotti, and then we lost just about everything else with Citizens United. This McCutcheon ruling that is in play now, amazingly enough, the concern there is that rich people, it's too complicated for rich people to fill out all the forms. So they're saying they want to massively increase the limits on what you can give to campaigns so that rich people can just give more to campaigns. So the fact of the matter is that these issues that you talk about become the critical thing. And I think the simple reality is that, and I don't think this is complicated at all. I think what we ought to do is a twofold initiative. One is to say that campaigns should be publicly financed. That the funding of campaigns should come from the public treasury. Perhaps you can do a Maine-style thing where small contributions can add up, but ultimately they should be publicly financed. And television should no longer be the primary vehicle by which we communicate about campaigns, except in a journalistic setting. Now, how do you change that? There's two ways to change it. One way is free airtime, to simply say that all the candidates get free airtime, everybody's got their way, but you can't buy your way in. Another way, an intriguing concept that's been proposed, is to say wealthy people can spend as much as they want on television. But from a regulatory standpoint, we require that if you put an advertisement on TV that talks about a candidate, the other candidate gets free airtime to respond. Now, think about that. That simple structure would render almost meaningless the value of pouring money in. Now, the wealthy person would have as much ability to spend as much as they want, no limit on their ability. If you want to say money is speech, they can speak to their heart's content. But when they do speak, somebody who isn't as wealthy as they are gets to speak as well. So there are ways to address this. And again, these radical concepts were parts of the original McCain-Feingold bill. The original McCain-Feingold bill back in the mid-1990s was a really good bill with free airtime components and all sorts of real changes. It got neutered down. And I only tell you this to remind you that we're really not talking about anything radical here. What we're talking about is simply, realizing the basic concepts of campaign finance reforms that were done in 1907, in 1974, in the initial stages of McCain-Feingold. These are not radical things, but we unfortunately have to amend the Constitution to get back to that, or we need a new Supreme Court. And, maybe you get a new Supreme Court if you're lucky. But, it's possible President Cruz's appointments won't be that good. So I hope that's an answer to your question, is that there are ways to do this, but the primary thing is to give people back the power to regulate the structures of elections. Woman back there had her hand up.
I do agree. I'm grateful for all the things you say. I wonder, though, how to explain what happened. I mean, I was so worried that Mitt Romney would win because he had much more money for ads, but he didn't. Elizabeth Warren was outspent tremendously by Scott Brown. I think Maggie Hassan was outspent by that guy.
Whose name we're still struggling to pronounce.
So, how do you explain this in the larger picture?
You have presented yourself well. Thank you so very much. That is an exquisite question. Now, you may have another chance to deal with Scott Brown here in New Hampshire. But the answer to your question, unfortunately, is an uglier statement than any of the other ones I will make tonight. The truth of the matter is, Barack Obama wasn't outspent overwhelmingly. When all is said and done, Barack Obama's total fundraising and that of groups that supported him was about $1.2 billion. Mitt Romney's and all the groups that supported him was about $1.3 billion. Now, admittedly, I still think that $100 million means something. But when you're in the billions, the reality is that in 2012, in the presidential race, big money beat big money. Obama was able to raise enough money to essentially match what Romney had. Similarly, in some of these other races you mentioned, there's something that in politics is referred to as starting gate equality. If you can raise a baseline of money, a real lot of money, and with all due respect, Elizabeth Warren raised a real lot of money, then even if your opponent spends some more than you can be outspent, but you're in the game. And also, with all due respect, it was Massachusetts. I mean, are you really telling me that Elizabeth Warren should have a hard time in Massachusetts? And so I'm just suggesting to you that what has happened with money is we've created a circumstance where even the Democrats have to raise so much money that it begins to define the process and the candidates, even the best of candidates. And this is a concerning reality. Somebody said this to me, this very interesting concept, and it was a labor activist. And he said, you know what? We can beat them back in any election. The question is, can we beat them back in every election from now on? Can we go to the mat, mobilize, raise all the money, just literally do it? And you think, well, yeah, but the other side has to do that. It's different for the other side. We studied Sheldon Adelson in the book. We write a lot about him. I love Sheldon Adelson. I want to just give him props. Because unlike so many people that spend money in politics, he's proud of it. He talks about it, and you, as a journalist, as a writer, I learn from what he says. And here's one of the most fascinating things about Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson is the guy who gave about roughly $200 million to Republicans in 2012. And people say, well, Sheldon Adelson, he lost. Romney didn't become president of the United States. A lot of the Senate candidates he backed didn't win. Yeah, but he also threw $2 million into the Michigan referendum on guaranteeing collective bargaining rights. And a month after that referendum lost, in the founding place of the United Auto Workers Union, Michigan enacted a right-to-work law. And so Sheldon Adelson, he didn't lose everything in 2012. But there's a fascinating thing. After the 2012 election, Sheldon Adelson went to Washington, D.C., and he gave some interviews. By the way, even though he lost, he was welcomed as a conquering giant. He could get into any office he wanted to get into. And they interviewed Adelson, and he said, I don't like this image of me as some big right-winger. And he explained how he was supportive of reproductive rights, sympathetic to gay rights. He actually had respect for national health care programs. Said Israel, which is a country he cares about very much, has a national health care program. And so he said, so I'm looking at this interview and I'm thinking, man, he should have been the Green Party nominee for president, right? He's good on all these issues. But then Adelson said an interesting thing. He said, the truth of the matter is I don't give campaign contributions based on my beliefs. These are business decisions. I give campaign contributions because of what's in the interest of my business efforts. I'm a very rich man. I want to be richer. And you see, this is the important thing. We have created in America a transactional politics. You may give money to Elizabeth Warren, and you may give it because you like her because of where she stands on the issues. But somebody with a lot more money will be giving money, deciding, how do I make the results I want for my business interests, my wealth? And the reason I tell this whole story and come around to it is, there's a wonderful aspect of the book. After the election, Sheldon Adelson said that he spent roughly $200 million. He gave himself an end-of-the-year bonus through stock options and stuff of $1.2 billion. That's why we need to think about how we structure our campaigns. Because if you're trying to keep Elizabeth Warren in the running with your $10 check, and the person you're up against is giving himself $1.2 billion bonuses, at the end of the day, your check writing hand is going to wear out. And we can't structure the rest of our politics around that. Gentleman right here in the middle.
As you made a chronology of the events that brought about some of the constitutional amendments in the past, do you think that a new constitutional amendment will come about because of some future catastrophic event that will occur that will make it happen?
It's a very interesting question. Gentleman asks, do we need a catastrophe to do the right thing? And this actually relates, it's a fascinating thing. A lot of my progressive friends will say, you know when we're going to get good progressive economic policy? When we get another rip-roaring depression. You know, it's sort of this theory of, well, things need to be awful before we can get what we want. The fact of the matter is that many constitutional amendments, many of the most important constitutional amendments, have not come in a moment of catastrophe, but have come in a moment of necessity. And this is an interesting reality. If you go through the history of this country, I think the better way to understand it is that there are critical junctures where the dysfunction of government becomes so notable that there is a broad acceptance that something has to happen. And these critical junctures have occurred at a lot of points in our history. The 1960s were a critical juncture. You can look back at them and you say, oh, you had the civil rights movement, you had the anti-war movement, you had the women's movement, you had all these things happening. But those things all happened then, not because they weren't problems a long time before. It was a point at which, for a variety of reasons, you unleashed this energy. Similarly, I think the progressive era from 1900 to 1920 was another era in this country where they saw so much concentration of wealth, so many problems, and real catastrophes like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, things of that nature, that people stepped up. So I don't necessarily think that you need some rip-roaring, unimaginable catastrophe in which to fix our problems. If that is the case, then we are in a very sad shape as a country. Because, I have a great friend, Tony Benn, a British parliamentarian. He's the longest serving member of the British Parliament at one point. And he's still alive. But he was alive in the 1930s. And he said, the 1930s were a time of great chaos and catastrophe in the world. And the interesting thing to understand about the 1930s is different countries responded in different ways. Some countries did wonderful things. And some countries did horrible things. The United States chose Roosevelt. The Brits chose Chamberlain. In Germany, Hitler rose. And you had Mussolini rising in Italy, somewhat prior to that. So you understand what I'm saying is, times of economic chaos and instability, you can move right, you can move left, you can move totalitarian, you can move democratic. And I would not counsel that it is wise to wait for a catastrophe. I would counsel that it is much wiser to believe in the power of organizing and the power of actually working at something. And the weird thing about it is, the 1960s was a period in which we had the civil rights movement. But, Medgar Evers started marching in Decatur, Mississippi in the 1940s, right? A. Philip Randolph started working on some of these issues in the 1930s. The fact of the matter is that things can come to a head at a certain point, but doing the work along the way is what really matters. And I passionately believe that we have a mass movement in this country which is dramatically undercovered by our media that is trying to fix the problems of this country. 16 states, as I said, have formally asked Congress to act on this issue. 500 communities across this country have formally asked Congress to overturn Citizens United, to act on these issues. And so we have a mass movement, real things happening in this country. What we need to do is charge it up. We can't count on the media to tell us, so we can't count on rich people to buy the ads. And so the only thing that gives me faith is that it is Sunday night, 8:40 in Exeter, New Hampshire. You people have lives. You could be doing so many other things, and yet you are here. Not because of me, I guarantee you. It is not because of me. It may not even be because of Marcia Moody. It may be because you actually care about your country. That caring is important. But now we have to focus it and to actually put our energy to trying to accomplish something. My sense is that if we do, this is not as hard as it might seem. I mean, Herb's going to come in here, and then I'm going to take that last question, then we're going to let you go home. After you bought some fine holiday gifts.
John, you probably know this.
Stand up, Herb. You know enough to do.
You probably know this, but I just want to share that over 60 communities in the state have articles on their town warrants to address the Citizens United thing. So
Isn't it ironic that I have come here today?
It is ironic, yeah. Widespread event, and for us in Exeter, those of you who live in Exeter, Tuesday is the voting date, and it's Article 23 on the ballot to say, yes, we want to tell our local representatives and our state representatives to have a constitutional amendment. There's also a very important Article 22 talking about tar sands. We want that one to pass as well, so just information.
unless you would like to be Nebraska. Yes. And I just quickly, one of the reasons that I'm excited to be up in New England during these 2 weeks is because this is town meeting time. And your town meetings actually matter. They're cool. And while New Hampshire is going to send a whole great big wampum message, a very powerful message to Congress about Citizens United, and it's going to matter a lot, and I'm going to write about it, and other people are, and we're going to, we just said 500 communities across this country. The end of this week, it's going to be 560 communities across this country, which is fabulous and a big deal. And it isn't just small towns, it's places like Los Angeles, big cities across this country, rising up with small towns to say we got to act on this thing. But the other cool thing is, once you start getting this democracy thing going, you know what happens? People start really thinking about what they could do. Do you know what 20 towns in Vermont, certainly no New Hampshire, but 20 towns in Vermont did last week? They voted to tell their legislature to create a state-run bank to compete with the big out-of-state banks, to put all of their state money into a publicly owned bank that gives loans at lower interest rates and that returns its profits to the state to do infrastructure projects in Vermont. That's democracy. Somebody back there's got the last question. A handsome fella.
He means you, Gordon.
Excuse me, I meant the guy next to me.
That's a young lady.
No, I'm sticking on that side.
I just wanted to really, I am optimistic. I want to leave us with a little hope here. Just a small example. Back in November, before good people like Hedrick Smith have come and Larry Lessig have come and all these petitions on the warrant articles, we got, our group has been sponsoring a full disclosure bill finally for New Hampshire, so we can at least figure out who these big money people are. It doesn't solve the problem. But, in this last election, when I was actually driving Hedrick Smith around, I said, my God, the Americans for Prosperity is intimidating these our Republican senators if they vote for Medicaid expansion or other things with a primary battle, and they've got a fund of $3 million. And he said, how can you prove that? I said, we can't. We don't have any laws that require them to disclose this. So we have a very tough disclosure law that got creamed in the Senate, in the committee. We got voted inexpedient to legislate out of the Senate in November. On January 26th, ladies and gentlemen, that bill passed the Senate 19-4.
Nice.
And
Very
it's
good.
a very strong bill. So, I mean, maybe I'm wishful thinking, but I'm saying, wow, what a change from November to January. and hopefully the House will pass it. So at least for the first time, we'll have that. And we've had bills for public funding that came out of two blue ribbon commissions, bipartisan blue ribbon commissions that came up with a plan that would work for New Hampshire, have gone nowhere. I'm getting optimistic that we're going to put them in next year and maybe something's going to happen. The polls show 96% of the people understand that big money politics is corrupting the whole system, but 91% figure we can't do anything about it. I think that 91% is starting to get on. And my God, I agree with you. Once we get that influence and once we get our power back, we might even talk about tax reform in the state of New Hampshire.
Does Marcia want to add some quick thing? I think Marcia's going to tell you the House is going to jump into this.
Yes, I had a bill, and my colleague Cindy Chase had a bill to expose ALEC for what they are with this model legislation. There's right to work, take the money away from public schools, privatize the prisons and everything. These are the bills that ALEC is putting into our legislature. We had two bills that wanted to expose what they were doing. And they were voted down in committee, and the House on Wednesday is about to kill them both.
Oh, so that's not what I wanted from you. Here we get this nice optimism here, and then we get Marcia saying, well, yeah, but there's darkness on the edge of town. Okay, this one, I promise I'm getting you out of here quick. This guy's actually acting against his own interest because he sells the books.
It's true, I should shut up. Quick question. The Affordable Care Act. I'm getting anecdotal evidence from friends and colleagues that it's easing their sense of what they have to do to be employed and have health insurance. Do you think that's going to have a positive impact on this type of thing?
Okay, now you went into an issue zone here, and that's dangerous, right? So let me circle this whole thing back in a broader sense. I think that ultimately the fight over the Affordable Care Act fits to all of these issues that my friend brought up over here about the scare and the fear and the moral elements that get thrown into all this. And you have to ask yourself, why? I think, by the way, first off, I'll begin by saying I don't like the Affordable Care Act. I'm not romantic about it. I don't like a lot of things in this country that I would love to change and make better. But and I happen to believe that America should have single-payer Medicare for all, health care for everybody. But the Affordable Care Act is a gateway, perhaps, to get us there. Bernie Sanders and others suggest that they could see routes through this that could get us there. I hope that's the case. I can tell you this. Why did the right fight so hard against the Affordable Care Act? Was it because they genuinely believed it was bad? If they did, they're stupid. Because this Affordable Care Act is one of the most moderate compromises imaginable. It actually floods public money into private insurance companies. It makes their campaign contributors richer. And so the reality of this thing is the Affordable Care Act is not exactly some sort of, great radical change. It is a rationalization that deals with some real problems in society. So why was the fight so hard against it? Well, the answer to that is very, very simple. It is the fear that it will work. And the fear that it will work is a very powerful thing for some of our more conservative friends. Because if you can give people a measure of stability as regards healthcare, if you can start to organize healthcare delivery in a responsible way, then you might start to discuss not just getting rid of the, some of the excesses of the insurance companies and maybe going toward a Medicare for all system, single-payer type system, which would still maintain a lot of our healthcare system, but would do it in a much more rational way. The potential for that is very frightening to some powerful people, and it's also frightening, this notion that government might actually work, right? If government could actually start to solve problems in this country, well, then the whole game gets changed in a whole bunch of ways. Because if government can solve problems, maybe it doesn't make that much sense to talk about privatizing public schools. Maybe it doesn't make that much sense about talking about getting rid of public employees. Maybe it doesn't make that much sense to talk about, in so many ways, undermining that which we can do as a community. And so I think this is the great debate, and when the day will come, right, when people say, oh, well, on balance, I'm going to go there, I'm going to offer you this notion as regards political parties. My next book is a history of the Republican Party, which, to my mind, is a really cool party, once upon a time. And, no, the book is called Republicans in Name Only, and it's an argument that the Republican Party of today is exactly what the Republican Party of 1854 was founded to stop. And that we have literally come full circle with this party. But the important thing to understand about all this is that political parties are these kind of weird behemoth structures that have so many, you can have within a Democratic Party, a radical leftist and somebody who is almost indistinguishable from a Republican. You can have a real wide range of people within political parties. And as a result, they tend to be lousy, particularly the Democratic Party, on messaging. It's not very good at talking to people about what it wants to do. And so the answer to your question is a very, very simple one. In this age of massive money and lousy journalism and sound bites and that, can the Democrats communicate effectively about what they're trying to do? If they can, my sense is that 2014 will not be a particularly bad year for them. If they can't, this could be a very bad year for them. This is about the quality of the message. And it's about one other thing. I love this room. I love everybody in this room. But you're a little old. Except for that woman in the back row there. Thank you for coming there. And I think you look pretty young, and you look pretty young. And mind you, the individual youth in the room is very exciting. But let me tell you a little something about politics. And this is the crisis of our moment, aside from just the money and everything else. There's a new Pew research poll that came out. It showed that among Americans aged 18 to 33, this is the millennial generation, born in 1980 and since. The generation was actually born and raised under Ronald Reagan. Apparently they were paying attention because only 19% of them identify as Republicans. Literally, less than 1 in 5 of the millennial generation identify as Republicans. Even when you push them as hard as you can, you must make a choice. Barely a third of them identify as Republicans. So young people are overwhelmingly liberal, if the polling is to be believed. And you say, well, yeah, but how can you prove it? Well, what do young people think about marriage equality? What do young people think about getting rid of student debt? What do young people think about a host of economic issues? What happens when young people actually go to the polls? Barack Obama won by 5 million votes in 2012. If you take a look at that millennial generation and you actually break down their number of votes and the percentages they gave, they contributed about 5.2 million votes to Obama's total. So his entire victory was rooted in the fact that young people showed up. And so my real answer to your question is this. We have a crisis of a small electorate, and we have a crisis of an old electorate. And an older electorate, while obviously it may include some incredibly progressive people, it will skew polling-wise to a slightly more conservative place. And so the critical thing for progressives at this point is to get serious about talking to young people. And when I say young people, I mean people under the age of 33. Because the polling tells you that if somebody under the age of 33 shows up at the polls, if 5 of them come to the polls, 4 of them are likely to vote Democratic. Not certain, because there's obviously variations in that 4. But only 1 of them says they're likely to vote Republican. That's an amazing political reality. And it's fluid, it can change next week, and people are variable. But I want to emphasize this to you. There are political interests in this country that there's very little value to them to have young people come to the polls. On balance, it's not going to help them at all. There are other political interests, and I'm going to make some guesses about people in this room for whom a very, very large youth turnout is absolutely critical to a functional politics. And so as you think about all these issues, you think, well, Mr. Nichols, he said a lot of stuff tonight. He said that we should amend the Constitution of the United States. That may take several weeks. Talked about full public financing of campaigns, talked about we talk in the book about revitalizing our media and really repairing our media. These are big, big things. A little thing that you can do between now and November is make sure that the young people you know, just the ones you know, get to the polls. If you do that, you will be making a fundamental intervention in our politics. And with that, having asked you to be fundamental interventionists, I will thank you so much for coming out tonight and giving me all this time.
Ron, you have honored us with your voice and your presence. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Please.